For nearly 9 years, the family and friends of Marvin Lopez waited in painful silence. The echoes of gunfire that took Marvin's life in the early hours of a July morning in 2016 had long since faded from the streets of Kearns, Utah. But for those who loved him, the weight of that night never left. Now, after nearly a decade of unanswered questions and cold leads, the Unified Police Department has announced a major break in the case. The investigation into Marvin's murder began just after 4 a.m. on the 10th of July, 2016, when officers from the Unified Police Department were dispatched to a local hospital following reports of a man with gunshot wounds. While en route, officers received a second report of shots fired near 5,450 South and 4,095 West in Kearns. Police responded to both scenes. While one group of officers arrived at the shooting location and began canvassing the area for shell casings or evidence, another group proceeded to the hospital. It was there they learned the identity of the victim, 24-year-old Marvin Lopez of West Valley City, who had succumbed to his injuries. Marvin had been shot 3 times, twice in the chest and once in the left leg. An autopsy later concluded that the cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds and ruled the manner of death a homicide. One of the most critical pieces of early evidence came from a witness who had driven Marvin to the hospital that morning. That witness provided a detailed account of the events leading up to the shooting, starting with a party at a house in Kearns, where Marvin and several others had gathered. According to the witness, earlier that morning, they had been standing outside with a few friends when a white Chrysler 300 slowly drove past the house. From inside the car, the group heard female voices and what sounded like a gang whistle or call. When the car reached the end of the street, gunshots were fired into the air from within the vehicle. Moments later, the group noticed a police car arrive in the area, possibly responding to the sound of gunfire. The group returned inside the house. Later, the witness went back outside and noticed a dark vehicle, possibly an Impala or Cavalier, driving slowly down the same street. The car reached the end, turned around, and drove past the house again. The witness saw that there were 4 Hispanic males inside the vehicle. The witness approached and asked if the group was lost. One of the males in the back seat responded, saying they were looking for someone named Smokey from Dogtown, referring to a local gang set. The witness, who knew of Smokey and other Dogtown gang members, said they didn't recognize anyone in the vehicle. Then the male in the back seat, described as young, Hispanic, with short hair, plucked eyebrows, wearing a black shirt and black hat, said he was Smokey from Dogtown. At that moment, Marvin Lopez walked up and told the group that he was from Dogtown. That brief exchange triggered a horrifying chain of events. The witness stated that as Marvin spoke, the male in the back seat suddenly produced a semi-automatic handgun. The witness and Marvin both turned and began to run. The male opened fire, shooting multiple rounds in their direction. As the car sped away, the witness saw that Marvin had been struck by the bullets. Panicked and desperate, the witness ran to Marvin's side and screamed for help. They then rushed Marvin into a car and drove him to the hospital in a race against time. Tragically, Marvin did not survive. In the aftermath of the shooting, officers worked to collect as much physical evidence as possible. In the immediate area of the reported gunfire, they found 2 9mm shell casings, which were submitted to the Utah State Crime Lab for ballistic testing. Then, 9 days after the murder, officers were alerted to a second possible crime scene near 5,586 South and 4,220 West, close to the location of the original gunfire report. There, they recovered more shell casings, which were also submitted for forensic analysis. The results confirmed that the casings from both scenes were fired from the same weapon, establishing a clear link between the 2 incidents. As detectives investigated further, they were able to confirm that the killing was gang-related, but despite the witness testimony and ballistic evidence, the investigation eventually stalled. Leads dried up, the suspect's identity remained unknown, and the case went cold. But the case was never truly forgotten. Detectives continued to revisit it over the years. In early 2025, nearly 9 years after Marvin's death, a key witness came forward and identified the shooter. The individual pointed to then 18-year-old Jimmy Alexis Lopez as the gunman who had opened fire on Marvin Lopez in 2016. With that identification, detectives built their case. On the 4th of February 2025, Lopez was taken into custody with the help of adult probation and parole. Although the suspect and the victim share a last name, authorities confirmed that they are not related. Lopez is now facing charges related to the murder of Marvin Lopez. Following his arrest, a search warrant was executed on Lopez's cell phone, and what investigators discovered only strengthened their case. The device contained evidence of gang involvement, including threats to shoot people, which aligned with the violent nature of the crime. Even more chilling were Lopez's digital footprints. After the shooting, he had used his phone to search for news articles related to the fatal shooting of Marvin Lopez, access the Salt Lake County Jail database multiple times, look up a Wikipedia article on gun ballistics, search for and follow steps to disable tracking on his Android phone, and then actually disabled it. These searches demonstrated what police believe was an effort to evade law enforcement and cover his tracks, suggesting that Lopez was deeply aware of the potential consequences of his actions. With the arrest of Jimmy Lopez, the Unified Police Department issued a public statement acknowledging the pain the Lopez family had endured for nearly a decade. The Unified Police Department recognizes that this arrest cannot undo the pain caused by this tragic loss. Our thoughts remain with the family and friends of Marvin Lopez, who have endured years of grief and uncertainty. We hope that this development brings them some measure of peace and justice. Marvin's family, still grieving, has requested privacy during this time. Despite this breakthrough, the case remains partially unsolved. Authorities believe that 3 other individuals were inside the vehicle with Lopez during the shooting, but their identities are still unknown. The Unified Police Department is now urging those individuals, or anyone who might know who they are, to come forward and contact investigators. These unnamed individuals could hold crucial pieces of the story, pieces that might finally complete the picture of what truly happened that morning in 2016. What began as a chaotic night of gunfire and panic has now come full circle with a long-awaited arrest. But as with many cold cases, this is not yet the final chapter. Marvin Lopez's family may finally have a name, but they and the community still await the full truth. In the early days of March 1998, the city of Toronto was shaken by the grim discovery of a young woman's body in a nondescript parking lot behind 130 Carlton Street. On the 8th of March, officers from the Toronto Police Service 51st Division responded to a call at the rear parking lot of this location, where they found the victim, later identified as 24-year-old Donna Ogilvie. Originally from the Philippines and a resident of British Columbia, Donna had only been in Toronto for about 5 weeks. She was 4 months pregnant with a boy and had another child. At the time, Donna was working as a sex worker, a fact that framed much of the investigation. The cause of Donna's death was determined to be strangulation, a violent end that stunned the community and left many questions unanswered. Early in the investigation, forensic experts developed a male DNA profile from evidence recovered at the scene, giving police a vital lead. However, despite this promising breakthrough, no match was found in the police databases, and the investigation quickly stalled. Detective Sergeant Steve Smith noted that it appeared to be a lady of the night transaction that tragically ended in Donna's demise. He added that while the suspect was believed to be a client that night, it remained unclear whether this was a single encounter or part of a pattern. The Toronto Police Service and the Missing Persons Unit's cold case section kept the case open and actively investigated it over the years, but sadly, the case eventually went cold. More than 2 decades later, renewed public interest briefly stirred the investigation. In December 2019, a YouTube video appealing for information about Donna's murder was released. Later, in October 2021, the case was featured in a Toronto police podcast that highlighted unsolved homicides, keeping the hope alive that one day justice might be served. The turning point came in 2022, when the Toronto Police Service submitted forensic evidence to Ogilvie, a forensic laboratory based in the Woodlands, Texas. Ogilvie specializes in investigative genetic genealogy, a cutting-edge technique that uses forensic-grade genome sequencing combined with genealogical research to identify suspects by tracing family trees, even when their DNA is not in criminal databases. Using this technology, Otham scientists were able to create a comprehensive DNA profile of the suspect. This profile was then shared with the Toronto Police Service to conduct a forensic genetic genealogy search, which resulted in new investigative leads. These leads pointed to a suspect living in Newfoundland, bringing fresh hope to a case that had remained unsolved for over 24 years. On the 6th of February, 2025 50-year-old Ronald Gordon Ackerman of Gander, Newfoundland, was arrested at Toronto Pearson International Airport after arriving on a flight from Edmonton. At the time of the murder, Ackerman had been living in Scarborough, Toronto, and working as a truck driver. More recently, he had been employed in the oil fields near Fort McMurray and was returning to his home in Newfoundland when apprehended. Although Ackerman's DNA was not previously in any police system, genetic genealogy traced the crime scene DNA through relatives to him. Law enforcement sources described Ackerman's reaction to his arrest as one of shock and disbelief. Detective Smith shared that although Ackerman was known to police for other matters, his name had never surfaced during the original investigation. The detectives believed that Donna's violent death resulted from a trick gone wrong, a client interaction that ended in tragedy. Detective Smith expressed the long-standing commitment of the investigators to seek justice for Donna and her family. He said, "For 26 years, investigators have remained committed to seeking justice for Donna and her loved ones." Advances in forensic technology, along with the unwavering dedication of our team and investigative partners, have led us to this arrest. Our thoughts remain with Donna's family and friends who have endured decades of grief and unanswered questions. No matter how much time passes, we do not give up on victims of slayings. This was a horrendous crime. She was vulnerable, working on the streets to make money. But we never forgot Donna. We never forget anyone. Donna's story is not just one of a crime solved, but a deeply human tragedy. A young woman, pregnant and far from home, struggling to survive in difficult circumstances, whose life was violently taken. Her death left a void for those who loved her and underscored the dangers faced by sex workers, who often live on the margins and are vulnerable to violence. The resolution of her case, though late, honors her memory by affirming that her life and death mattered, and that even after decades, the truth can emerge. The use of investigative genetic genealogy illustrates the incredible advances in forensic science that are transforming cold case investigations worldwide, offering renewed hope to families waiting for justice. As Ronald Gordon Ackerman awaits trial on first-degree murder charges, Donna's family can finally begin to find some peace. The community also reflects on the progress made in forensic science and the relentless dedication of law enforcement in never giving up on victims. Anyone with information about Ronald Ackerman or this case is encouraged to contact the Toronto Police anonymously through Crime Stoppers. This case serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how much time passes, justice can still be served and no victim is ever forgotten.
Marlene Major was not just a name in an old case file. He was a mother, a daughter, and a woman with dreams, love, and a life that mattered. Before she became the subject of whispered suspicions and cold case investigations, she was a young woman full of life. She had a laugh that could light up a room, a kindness that drew people in, and a fierce love for her children. She was the kind of mother who took pride in the little things, packing lunches, tucking her children in at night, humming a tune as she folded laundry. To the outside world, she was just another wife and mother, but to those who truly knew her, she was so much more. But Marlene's life was not easy. She was married to Bill Major, a man who had a darkness inside him. He wasn't the kind of man who showed his rage in public, but behind closed doors, he was someone else entirely. The control, the cruelty, the suffocating grip he had over Marlene, it was a prison she couldn't escape. Still, she endured it, not for herself, but for her children. Lalana Bramble, Marlene's daughter, was only 4 years old when her mother disappeared. At that age, she didn't fully understand what had happened. All she knew was that her mother had been there one day and was gone the next. And when she asked questions, her father gave her answers that didn't sit right, even to a child. She was a drug addict, he told her, an alcoholic, a prostitute. She didn't care about you. She ran off with another man. It was the kind of story that was meant to end conversations, not invite more questions. It was the kind of lie that Bill Major hoped his children would believe without hesitation. But as the years passed, Lalana began to see the cracks. Her father was not a man to be trusted. He was abusive, violent, and cold, and as she grew older, she began to suspect that the story he had told her was just that, a story. The truth, she feared, was far darker. Then, a year after Marlene disappeared, something was found in the woods. A skull fragment, stripped of its jaw and teeth, was discovered not far from the home Marlene had shared with Bill. It was impossible to tell who it had belonged to, and in the days before DNA testing, there was no way to confirm anything. The case, already cold, was left to collect dust. Years turned into decades. Bill Major continued on with his life, free and unbothered. He raised his children, fed them lies about their mother, and lived as though nothing had ever happened, but Lalana never forgot. She carried the weight of her mother's absence with her, and as she grew into adulthood, that weight became impossible to ignore. She confronted her father. "Just tell me what you did with her body," she said, "so we can bury her. I won't push for you to be prosecuted. I just want to know." But Bill Major only laughed. "If you think I'm going to tell you where your mother's body is," he said, "you're crazy." At that moment, Lalana knew. There was no longer room for doubt. Her father had killed her mother, and if he thought she would let it go, he was wrong. The investigation reopens. By the year 2000, Lalana had spent 2 decades living in the shadow of her mother's disappearance, but she refused to let it be forgotten. She walked into the Boone County Courthouse and demanded that someone listen to her. That someone was newly elected prosecutor, Linda Talley Smith. Smith had a reputation for closing cases that others had abandoned, and when she heard Lalana's story, she knew this was one of those cases that couldn't be ignored. First, they needed to prove that the skull found all those years ago belonged to Marlene. Special investigator Todd Kenner was called in, and using modern forensic techniques, he began the process of confirming what many had long suspected. A DNA test was conducted, comparing a sample from the skull to a sample from Lalana. The results were undeniable. The skull belonged to Marlene Major. Now, after 2 decades, Marlene was no longer just missing. She was confirmed dead. But how had she died? Forensic anthropologist Dr. Emily Craig examined the skull and made a chilling discovery. There was a gunshot wound to the head, with an exit wound at the top of the skull. This was no accident, no disappearance. This was murder. And there was more. There were deep cuts along the bone, signs of an attempt at decapitation. The marks were straight and deliberate, as if made by a thick-bladed weapon like an axe. And even more horrifying, there was clear evidence that someone had intentionally removed Marlene's jaw. The reason was clear. Her killer had wanted to prevent her from being identified. All signs pointed to Bill Major. But the investigators needed more. A killer's own words. Bill Major had been careful for years. In 1996, he had made a mistake. During a phone call with his own father, Jim Major, Bill had allegedly confessed. "I killed Marlene," he had said. But the call had not been recorded, and Jim Major's word alone wasn't enough to convict his son. So investigators decided to try again. In 2000, Jim Major agreed to let police record a conversation between him and Bill. It was a long shot, but they hoped Bill would slip up. And he did. On the recorded call, Jim asked his son one simple question. "Why won't you tell me where you buried Marlene?" There was a pause on the line. Finally, Bill spoke. "Yeah," he said, "and put me in jail for life." It was a confession. There was no denial, no outrage at the accusation, just a statement that if he told the truth, he would be locked away forever. It was all investigators needed. Bill Major was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Justice, at last. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. The skull, the DNA test, the confession, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Bill Major had murdered his wife, dismembered her body, and spent 2 decades living free. The jury took less than an hour to reach a verdict. Guilty. Bill Major was sentenced to life in prison in a Kentucky correctional facility. For some, the punishment was not enough. "If I could get my hands on him," one family member said, "I'd hang him myself." For Lalana, the conviction was a step toward healing. She had spent her entire life haunted by what had happened to her mother, but now, after years of pain and unanswered questions, she finally had some measure of peace. "I've always felt guilty," she admitted, "because in my mind she died trying to protect us from him." Now, at last, Marlene Major could rest, and the man who had taken her life would never walk free again. Marlene Major's story is one of heartbreak, injustice, and perseverance. For 20 years, her children lived with the pain of not knowing, the frustration of unanswered questions, and the agony of suspecting the one man who was supposed to protect them. But it is also a story of resilience, the relentless fight of a daughter who refused to let her mother's memory fade into the cold files of an unsolved case. Justice, though delayed, was finally served. Bill Major, once confident that he had committed the perfect crime, now spends the rest of his days behind bars, paying for the unspeakable horrors he inflicted upon his wife and children. But for victims of domestic violence, justice is not always guaranteed. Marlene's story is a tragic reminder that too many women suffer in silence, trapped in abusive relationships with no way out. Many don't get the chance to escape. Some, like Marlene, lose their lives at the hands of the very person who vowed to love them. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, don't wait. There is help, there are resources, there are people ready to listen, support, and protect. In the US, you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-79-9-SAFE. If you are in immediate danger, call 911. No one should have to live in fear. No one should have to fight alone. Marlene Major's voice was silenced, but her story speaks for so many others. Let it serve as a call to action, to stand up, to speak out, and to ensure that justice is not something that comes decades too late.